When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger for thousands of appetizing ingredients that inspire countless mouthwatering meals. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices. Plus, extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week and up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with points. So you can get big flavors and big savings. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I am very excited to welcome to the show for the very first time, Amy McElroy. Amy, welcome.
Thank you, Rebecca. Very kind of you to invite me.
Well, you know, I've kind of seen you around the social media circuits for years and have seen your books. And I don't know, sometimes it's just like one of those things where you just don't reach out or you just assume somebody is busy or life gets busy. But I am so happy that I get to sit here and talk to you today about educating the Tudors.
Me too. Thank you for inviting me. Thrilled to be here.
Well, let's get into this because I think this is a really interesting subject. I can't even imagine, like, it encompasses so much. My first question has to be, how did you choose this subject?
So it sounds quite cliche, but if you read anything about Henry VIII, when he's younger, everyone refers to him as a Renaissance prince. Everyone. So, and to me, that word kind of meant the art, the literature. So I was like, well, why is he a Renaissance prince? Like, what made him into like this? Why was he different from the other kings, the other princes that were in Europe at the time? And it led me into a bit of a rabbit hole about his education. So I started off looking at his education first and then comparing it to Arthur and his sisters, because I thought, well, I still don't get it, because what was different? And as I started looking at the comparisons, that's what made me realize, okay, this is why he was a Renaissance prince. This is why he had that reference to him and everyone associates him with learning. But then I thought, okay, so that's him and his siblings. What about his kids? Like, did he pass on this Renaissance curriculum to his children? And then it kind of developed from there into, well, what about your everyday children? And what if they couldn't go to school? What did they do? And what was school like back then compared to what we do now? What were the different avenues into education? And then who actually taught them? So I wanted to know a bit about that as well. So who was responsible for teaching the royal family, but your normal everyday children as well? So yeah, it started off as a rabbit hole that then led into other rabbit holes. Here we are today.
As it usually happens, one rabbit hole into another. There might be a wormhole in there as well.
Yeah.
Well, I am so grateful that you wrote this book because this is a subject matter that I think for myself, I never had the patience to research. So I'm glad that you've done this book and you did a brilliant job on the research on this book. Why don't we just start with Arthur and Henry? Because obviously Arthur was the firstborn son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, expected to be the next king of England. So Henry VIII, no, I'm going to go back. I'm not going to mix the two up. Let's just start with Arthur. What did his education look like as the Prince of Wales and the heir to the throne?
So Arthur had a very good education. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it was any worse than Henry's. But his role was predominantly to learn how to govern. So although he did have what we'd class as formal lessons with tutors, a lot of his time was spent learning how to govern. So when he was in Ludlow, he was seeing how councils worked, how to interact with his tenants, things like that. Whereas Henry had a lot more free time. But Arthur definitely still had a formal education. He just didn't have the time to spend on it like his siblings did. So he was obviously busy learning how he would rule his kingdom one day, if he was to, which unfortunately he wasn't. But that was what his role was. So the primary objective for him was to learn how to take over his father when that time came. So I think it was just that the priorities differed rather than either being better or worse than each other, if that makes sense.
Yeah. How old was Arthur when his education started?
So the Arthur would have been very, very young, so 3, 4, when he would have started learning little bits. As he grew up a bit, he obviously would have learned to read and write. Um, would have studied Latin as well, because at the time it was the language of the church, it was the language of the law. French was spoken a lot as well. So he would have learnt that, and he would have learnt things like grammar. So grammar was quite a big subject back then. For us now, we interpret it as the grammar if you're reading a book, like, but for them it incorporated different lessons. So things like history and law, all of that was encompassed under grammar. So
Hmm.
it is actually quite confusing, but he would have been very, very young when he started lessons, that they were not slacking with Arthur's education at all.
Well, no, because he was going to be the next king, right?
Yeah, no time for playtime.
So, as far as Arthur goes, who was the person or people who educated him?
Arthur actually had a number of people around him. So he would have learnt a great deal from different bodies. He's a little bit different from his siblings in that we can say, for instance, with Henry, that Skelton was actually affixed as his tutor. Arthur didn't have that privilege of being able to just sit in a classroom with his siblings. He was constantly learning. So he had more of a group of people. He would have had tutors, but his education was different. So he wouldn't have had the same format of education in what his younger siblings did.
Hmm.
So it would have come from different people according to what he needed to learn. So his counselors would have been influential in his education, things like that.
Now that you say that, it makes me wonder, did Arthur have um, friends that were educated alongside him like some of the other royals did?
I believe he would have. We don't know for certain, but we do know that the royal children did often share a schoolroom with other children that were either wards of the crown or children of the nobility that were also staying wherever they were at the royal household. So I can't see that Arthur would have been any different, except I don't think that they would have been as constant. So I think it would have been a little bit more varied for him, and I don't think he would have had that close companionship that the others had the opportunity to develop, which is a shame for someone so young to not be able to form those bonds. But I assume that he was allowed to play with his counselors' children and things like that when they did have time. But yeah, I don't think he got to form the bonds that his siblings did when they were younger.
That's too bad. But it made me wonder for a second, like, what would his court have looked like, right? Because Henry VIII had Charles Brandon and all of those men around him that he had known for years. And it's like, what were the names of the people that Arthur used to hang out with? What would the Tudor court have looked like underneath?
Yeah, I think it'd have looked quite different.
Mhm.
Um, I think he would have made friends as he grew up and became king. But sadly he didn't get the chance. But yeah, I think it would have looked quite different myself.
Mm. And I think you said in your book that and if I get this wrong, please correct me, his formal education ended about the time that he married Catherine.
Yes. So when he married Catherine and they went off to Ludlow, their time would have been spent um obviously showing Catherine her new surroundings, but ultimately his education was done by that age. That wasn't unusual for education to finish around that time. Um, as the royal prince, he could, of course, read whenever he wants. So that's his prerogative. He wants to keep learning, but the formal side of it would have finished, which is around normal age anyway. So he
Okay.
would have just gone on to continue to learn how to govern instead.
Hmm. So he was what, 15, I think, when they got married. So they're like, here, you're a married man. We're going to send you off to Ludlow. You're going to go do
Yeah.
your thing over there. You're good, right, buddy?
Yeah, sounds very young to us now, doesn't it?
Yes. Well, thank goodness he had Catherine of Aragon by his side. She was so well educated as well.
Yeah.
Well, then we have, of course, then Arthur passed away unexpectedly, way too early. And his brother Henry was the spare. So now Henry is the heir to the throne. He was like, what, 10 years old?
Yeah.
So let's talk about what Henry's education looked like prior to being the heir, and then how it changed, if it changed at all, after he became the heir of the throne.
Okay, so Henry had I suppose what you'd say more of a formal education than Arthur in that he wasn't expected to be king. He didn't have to learn all that governing. All he had to do was learn. At the time, the Renaissance was sweeping across Europe. So what that meant was that there was more of a flavour of humanism in learning. And Henry VII was actually very instrumental in bringing humanists and all that came with it to the English court, which meant that his young son did benefit from it. So Henry's education was actually quite a humanist curriculum. So rather than studying the medieval manuscripts that were popular at the time and were still popular, Henry's took on more of looking at the ancient writers of Greece and Italy. So he would be looking at like the church fathers, their texts, things that they hadn't been forgotten, but there was an air around some of the texts possibly being classed as pagan, so the church didn't necessarily like them, or that they're so old that why are we reading them now? There's better things to read. Whereas the humanists thought that no, we do need to go back to these because they're written like from the original languages. So they're written in original Greek. And so that's where it all came from. They wanted to understand the original words of these texts. And Henry's education basically went along those lines. So he had very good tutors, and by all means, I haven't seen anything that says he wasn't. He was a very good student. There were specific aspects of education. So one of them was done in grammar school it's called the Trivium. So it was grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Henry would have undertaken that, but obviously he wasn't at school, so he would have done it with his tutor. And as I said earlier, it does encompass a lot of different subjects. So he would have learned geography, poetry, all of those types of things, history under those. When people move up into college, they then go on to what's called the quadrivium, which is astronomy, geometry, music, and arithmetic. Again, Henry probably did study a lot of that stuff, but he just wasn't in what we would class as an educational institute. He had his own tutors, but his was very much along the lines of a humanist approach. So he was studying what we call the classic authors and the church fathers.
It sounds like Henry was so educated and well groomed to rule the kingdom that intrigues me a little bit that when he became king, then he seems to have just sat back and let other people do the work for him.
Yes, I think I would say Henry was very, very intelligent, and I don't think he ever lost his thirst for knowledge. Um, but he obviously wasn't expecting to be king. And I think when Arthur passed away, his education did change a bit in that Henry VII obviously knew that he's now going to have to be king. So he did start taking him to meetings and things like that so he could start to learn. But he didn't have the time that Arthur did. And I think Henry VII did keep him close. And I know some will say it was probably quite um, over the top how close he kept him. But personally, I kind of think you can understand it. He's lost his heir. His next son doesn't know how to govern, and he doesn't know how long he's got left. None of us do. So I think it was a case of we need to teach him everything we can now. So I think Henry probably felt that once he got the throne, it's party time. I've got some freedom. And I suppose you can't really blame him, can you? So he's a young lad still. So I think he's probably just thought, I've got all of these older, qualified people. They can do it for a bit and I'll go and have some fun and
Yeah,
spend money.
he did have a good time, didn't he?
Mhm. Yeah.
Well, what did their average day of learning look like? Because it wasn't just learning the classics and learning math and astrology or not astrology, astronomy, really. Um, it wasn't just that all day long, was it? There was a bit of religious stuff as well, right?
Yes. So religion was very important to them. So they would be studying the Bible. They would do writing exercises. So that was part of their lessons. But it wasn't all like sitting in a classroom. They had other things like they would play sports. So even sports were classed as part of a boy's education. So especially someone like Henry, he should know how to ride. So things like that were technically part of their education. So I'm sure he probably enjoyed the sports side of it more. But yes, he wasn't stuck in a classroom all day, fortunately for Henry.
Well, we do know that Henry liked to show off his muscular calves, so he was definitely
Hmm.
into.
Yes. Yeah.
So basically, when you were saying like they'd go outside and they'd be active, I was like, that's what we would call gym class here in
Yeah.
America. They also had gym class. Let's get outside and exercise and do some stretches and maybe ride a horse for a while and play some
Yeah.
archery and
Yeah. Archery, bit of tennis.
yeah, yeah, he did like tennis, didn't he?
Yeah.
It does seem like something like jousting seems rather dangerous to have the heir to the throne participate in.
Yes, they were taught. So they had something that was called running at the rings. So they weren't facing an opponent. They were facing a hoop that was attached and they had to obviously hit that as the target. So there was practice. It wasn't just go ahead and run at that opponent on your huge war horse. So yes, they were taught, and again, that would have formed part of his education. Obviously, not all boys would have been taught that, but as a royal prince, yes, very important.
And one of the people, when I think of Henry VIII, one of the people that comes to mind is Erasmus and Henry's love for Erasmus. When did that love story begin between him? I don't know what else to call it. Henry's love story with Erasmus. When did that begin?
So I'm actually writing about Erasmus at the moment, and when Henry was little and he was at Eltham with Margaret and Mary and baby Edmund, um, Erasmus had come over to visit Mountjoy and Moore. And they said, we're going to go for a walk. and they went to Eltham. And Thomas More had produced some writing because obviously back then how well you could write was, it was one of those things you had to show it off. And he gave it to Henry. And Erasmus was apparently very, very embarrassed that there's a royal prince here and nobody told me that I'm coming to see him. Nobody's like given me warning so I could prepare some writing. And so they stayed for dinner, and Henry apparently passed him a note and challenged him to some words. So he spent the next few days writing a poem that was then presented to Henry, and it's all about Henry VII and young Prince Henry and how they're the glory of England. And yeah, so I think that was the start of it. And I think following that, Erasmus's fame obviously increased. And I think Henry always probably kept a close eye on how he was doing. And then in turn, Erasmus would come back to England. There was always dedicated works being flung around. So, yeah, I think it was just one of those things that started when he was little and embarrassed Erasmus in the interim.
So what I heard you say is the love story began with a love poem.
Yeah, pretty much.
Erasmus wrote him a poem, confessed his love and how great he was. I'm sure Henry ate that up too. He was like, yeah, that's right. Stroke my ego, buddy. I am the greatest prince there is. I think Henry VIII is fascinating to me. And I know that people love to hate him, but as a king of England and what his life looked like from little on, it's fascinating to me where it started and where it ended and all of the challenges in between. I'm sure you would agree.
Oh, definitely. I know a lot of people dislike him, but I think if you separate out some of the things that he did do, so for instance, building of the Navy, things like that, I think you can't deny that he did great things. So, yeah, it is obviously not great, the type of person that he ended up being, but I think we have to be careful not to judge people in modern terms because for us today, obviously we wouldn't go and cut somebody's head off. We wouldn't hang, draw, and quarter somebody, but then that was the punishment. It's not necessarily, well, it is still cruel. You could say it's still cruel, but we're in a completely different time. So I think we just have to be careful in judging somebody against modern society and what we expect. Although I'm not going to say he was an angel, he definitely wasn't an angel.
No, I don't think anybody would say he was an angel.
No, definitely not.
Okay, so now that we've covered Arthur and Henry, let's move to his sisters, because of course we're always fascinated by women in history and how their lives looked a little different. And Margaret was older than Henry, but younger than Arthur. And then we also have Mary, who was the youngest of the surviving infancy children.
Yeah.
Maybe is the best way to say it. There was one bit that you wrote about Mary that I want to make sure that I touch base on. So this is me trying not to forget that I'm going to ask you about that. But let's start with Margaret. So as the eldest daughter, did she have any different of an education, or was the education of the girls in general the same?
Between the girls, it was very, very similar. Compared to Henry, very different. There were some shared bits, and it's thought that they did get to share some of his lessons. But obviously, Margaret was older, so she wouldn't have gone to all of his lessons because back then it was just thought girls didn't need to know all of this stuff. So if it related to reading, writing, religion, then maybe, and even things like the French language. Yep. But when it came to learning about history, things like that, they didn't think girls needed to know that. The recommendations were very different. It was more a girl should know how to run her household, how to manage her staff, things like that. So even basic arithmetic, so they could keep track of their own account. So I don't know if you've seen it, but Elizabeth of York's account book, she's signed the bottom of every single page. It's fascinating. So it's things like, did she actually sit there and tally all this up herself? And so the girls would have learnt, obviously, they had a great role model in their mother and their grandmother. So we know that Margaret Beaufort was very good at French.
Hmm.
So they had that influence around. So, yes, different to Henry's, but they still would have shared a few lessons. So, yeah,
Yeah.
that's how I'd probably answer that one.
So they weren't only taught by their mother, they also had tutors, right?
Yes, so it is thought that Margaret, Henry, and Mary were all taught to write by their mother based on their handwriting and that it looks quite similar to hers. Obviously, we don't know for certain. Um, but the girls would have had tutors as well. But they wouldn't have been as predominant, should I say, as Henry's. So, for instance, John Skelton, when he was tutoring Henry, it is thought that Mary sat in some of those lessons,
Hmm.
but we don't know to what extent. So they definitely would have had a tutor of some sort, but we just don't know what the extent of that was, or whether they would spend as much time with a tutor rather than their ladies. So they would have used all their mother's ladies, for instance, to learn how to embroider and things like that. They would have done that not with what we would class as a tutor, but then to them it was still education. Somebody still had to teach them to do it. So it was just a different form of education.
Did they get gym class too?
The girls knew how to ride, and I know Margaret was apparently very good at hunting.
Oh,
I'm sure it was Margaret apparently went hunting on her way up to Scotland when she got married. So yeah, I'm pretty sure she was successful in killing a stag or something. Can't remember off the top of my head on her way to Scotland. So they knew how to hunt. So yeah, and could ride.
impressive. Yeah. Hawking, maybe?
Probably, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mary used to go out hunting with her dad and Catherine of Aragon. So, yes.
I love that. Well, I'm glad that you brought up Mary and Catherine of Aragon because now I can touch the point that I wanted to when we first started talking about this. Was I was so fascinated when I was reading your book when you talked about how Mary could speak Spanish or sing in Spanish after she was betrothed to Charles. And that blew my mind, Amy. I can't even tell you, like, as many times as I talked to Dr. Emma about Catherine of Aragon and the Spanish court and all of that stuff, I don't think once we've covered the fact that little Princess Mary learned Spanish, and she probably learned it from Catherine of Aragon.
I honestly believe that Mary is very, very underestimated. Um, when she was betrothed, we know she said her vows, like in French. So I think she's very underestimated. Like she was a young girl and could speak French, and yes, she could sing in Spanish. And obviously, she did have Catherine of Aragon, so it may have just been she had no idea what she was saying. She was
Right.
just repeating words, but she learned it. So yeah, I think she definitely deserves more credit than she's given.
She does. She really is underestimated. She's just another one of those figures from Tudor history that I feel like gets brushed under the rug a little bit. Like, oh, and then there was Mary and she married that French king and then Charles Brandon, whatever.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's definitely a lot more to Mary than people think.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to Margaret and Mary, and let's say when Henry was still under that household with his mother, was it just them, or were there other like wards and kids there too, or was it just the royal children?
No, there were other wards. And we also know that Mary had a French companion, so called Jane Poppincourt.
Oh, yeah, I know that name.
So she was brought in to help Mary learn French. So there were definitely other children. We know that Henry had friends when he was younger, um, that were brought up almost in the royal household. So they wouldn't have obviously lived there all the time. But if their parents were there and had brought them, then they would have shared the schoolroom with the royal children. So yeah, Henry definitely had a school friend or two. So
Yeah.
and Mary obviously had Jane. I think the one that I'm most unclear about is Margaret because she was older. So I don't think she had as much opportunity of making friends, a bit like Arthur, as Henry did, because he was obviously the prince. Everybody wanted to be around him. He had the influence. So, and Mary was obviously the youngest princess. She was the baby of the family.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think for poor Margaret, she probably had less opportunity of friends. I think her friends were probably her maids and her ladies in waiting. So
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is while Mary is coloring in her coloring books, Margaret's out hunting and killing stags by comparison. I'm just going to find a modern equivalent for everything in this episode. Gym class, coloring books,
yeah,
we have to make it relatable, right?
yeah.
The first thing when you're describing these classrooms, it popped into my head. And I was like, I wonder what these classrooms look like. Did they look like how we see them today with like rows of chairs and desks? Do we know what their classrooms look like?
We know bits. So we know that I'm skipping a bit now, but we know that Edward had a desk and we know that in his classroom he had certain items. So you can kind of guess that Henry probably had the same kind of thing. So they would have had a room that was set up as a schoolroom with what we would call desks now. Not rows and rows, obviously, because there wasn't that many. It was probably quite small. Well, not small in size, but set up for a small number. But they would have needed, obviously, writing implements and things like that. So all that would have been there ready for them, along with, obviously, it's the royal household. So they do have books. So they would have had the books there, parchment for them to write on, things like that. So yeah,
I don't know why I
kind of like our schoolrooms, but just old.
old. In my head, I picture this is exactly what I picture, and this might date me by saying this, and you're gonna know how old I am now. I remember being in like elementary school, which over here is like from age 5 to 12. And we had these desks, and the top of the desk would lift
I
up, and
knew you were going to say that.
you would store everything inside. This is what I picture. Like Edward would show up for school, he would open the top of his desk and pull out his books and his inkwell and close it. And
I knew you were going to, as soon as you said, this is going to age me, I knew you were going to say the lift up desks. 'Cause I remember them too.
and then you had the little slot on the top that you could put your pencil in so that it wouldn't roll down. That's what they had in the Tudor times. I'm just going to put that out there. Everybody starts spreading that around. That's when those desks originated. Oh my gosh, I've lost my mind today, I think. Okay, all right. So we talked about the children of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Now let's transition a little bit to the royal children of Henry VIII and what their education looked like. Was it the same as what Henry had growing up, or was it more advanced? What did it look like for Mary and Elizabeth and Edward?
So I'll start with Mary. So Mary had an exceptional education, especially for a girl at that time. And I would expect it because look at who her parents are. So you've got Catherine, who is extremely well educated, and Henry, who is extremely well educated. So you can imagine that they wanted to, obviously, their daughter to have that same type of education. There was still the thought that girls shouldn't need to learn certain things. So Catherine of Aragon did commission Joan-Louis Vives to write a curriculum for Mary. And there are things in there that she wasn't really allowed. Well, I say wasn't, it was more frowned upon. So she shouldn't read romance and that kind of thing. She should focus on works that are focused on religion, good deeds, things like that. So, and especially tales of women. So learning about other women that had been role models or had passed on a lesson that was a valuable lesson, things like that. So Mary, for a girl, incredible education, but it was, in my opinion, a bit more restricted than Elizabeth's. I think Elizabeth, because she was declared illegitimate at a young age and all of that, I think she had more freedom. So, and I think by then there was a lot of like the humanism had grown so much that the curriculum had expanded, the number of tutors, there was more humanist tutors, but also the religious leanings had started moving as well. So Edward and Elizabeth had more of a Protestant education, whereas obviously Mary definitely not, as was Catholic through and through. So their religion side would have been different. Edward was very much like his father's education, so humanist. He would have studied grammar, logic, all of those things, including history, war, all of that. The girls, well, I say the girls, Elizabeth basically studied what she wanted to. So languages, we know that Mary was very well educated, so she would translate things, same as Elizabeth. So we know that Elizabeth was still translating things when she was queen for fun. So I think all of them were very, very intelligent, and the education, especially the girls that they had for the time, was incredible. Like, I can't speak that many languages, and you've got Elizabeth speaking all kinds of different languages, being able to translate all kinds of different things. And yeah, she was a girl in the Tudor era, so fair play to both of them, I say. I think they were both very exceptional women with brilliant educations, just different.
Yeah. I feel like we hear so much about how many languages Elizabeth spoke, and we hear about how smart Mary was and how well educated she was. I feel like Edward is the dummy left behind. How many languages did Edward speak? Do we ever hear about this?
He would have spoken Latin and French. But I think that's just par for the course of being a royal at that point.
Right.
I don't know of anything of him speaking other languages other than them. But yes, his sisters definitely left him in the wind on the language front, definitely.
And Edward's behind us, like scratching his head. I mean, it makes sense, right? Because French was the language of diplomacy, so he would need to know
Yes.
that. And Latin is another one of those, the church.
Yeah.
And during Edward's time, that started to change. Things were more in English,
Yes.
but Latin was the basis of it for so long. And so many nobles and aristocrats could speak Latin because of that.
Yeah, definitely.
So I think that's interesting. I'm glad we talked about that because I was like, we always talk about how many languages Elizabeth knew and make her come, she's like, well, she knew Greek and she knew Latin and French and probably Spanish. I don't know, all these other languages. Yeah, that's fascinating. So I feel like I want to transition now to the children of aristocrats to understand what their education looked like versus that of the royal children. Now, we know some of them probably were educated alongside the royal children, but what about those who weren't? How were they taught?
Those that weren't, possibly would have had tutors at home. So no different to the royal household. What you would have found is, for instance, if you're a duke, you would have your son at home. He would be having his tutor there. You'd have other families that would be sending their children to you. Aristocratic families, not just your everyday. They would send their children to what they perceived as beneficial homes to learn. So those children would share the lessons together, but it was kind of seen as a stepping stone. So it was like a way into a better household to learn how do they live and hopefully get better opportunities as they grew up. So they wouldn't have just been sat at home with a tutor studying on their own. There would have been shared classroom, well, shared studies. If they didn't have that and they weren't one that was visiting another home, then they would have gone to school. So there were schools. For the nobility, they definitely probably would have gone to a grammar school. So very different to what we know it as now, but it was essentially for boys only, so girls weren't allowed. If they went to grammar school, they could then either go to college, so Cambridge and Oxford were around. And there was the Inns of Law as well. So that was if you wanted to go into the profession of law, obviously, but you didn't have to stay. So what you could do, so if you're a young nobleman, you could go to school, go to college and do a bit of what you wanted to, go to the Inns of Law and study maybe a bit about contract law. Once you've got what you think will help you, you can leave. So it was beneficial for them because they needed to understand contracts. How does land law work? Things like that. Because at one point, they would own their own lands. They needed to essentially not be ripped off or things like that. They needed to understand that. So that was a beneficial way of not only getting them educated, but so they could actually use those skills later on once they came into their inheritance or whatever. There was obviously another final stage as well, which not all of them would do. This was a kind of, it was seen as a trip, I suppose. So they would go around Europe and they would visit different courts or different households. And it would be a way for them to see how different countries work or how the different courts work. They would be able to expand or start making their own little networks, and also hugely important, practice their language skills. So it was about getting their sons out there, make acquaintances, build some networks up, practice your French or your Spanish, and then come home. And then when they come home, they'd be old enough, hopefully, to go into the royal court at some appointment or another.
Yeah. So it was like studying abroad.
Yes, exactly.
I
Yep.
love that idea. I had never heard that before, and I think that is absolutely fascinating because it would make them more worldly. They would understand how these other courts worked, and like you said, they could be able to practice their language skills. What better way than to be immersed in it?
Yep. Some obviously would go and study purposely abroad, so they would go to a foreign university, or they would go and employ a tutor. So we know that some of the nobility were employing Erasmus abroad as their tutor. That's why he ended up back in England. So we know that it happened. So I think it was just what were the benefits? And for them, I think it was about creating that network and helping them learn those languages that would be beneficial for them once they got back home.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Okay. So an hour always goes so fast. And I think I want to end today on talk because this is going to be a subject that the listeners would be mad at me if I didn't ask you about is let's talk about the education of the common folk
Yes.
and what that looked like because they were just the average people like you and me. So how were they educated?
in a massively different way. So if they were lucky enough, there was somewhere in their village or town that could be classed as a school. And I'm not saying a school what we think of today. It could be a room in somebody's house that had been dedicated or allowed to be used as a schoolroom for local children. It could be that the local priest is teaching them in the church a few days a week. So it ultimately depended, first of all, where they lived, but secondly, what their parents could let them do. Because some of them, they couldn't let their children go to school because they needed them. They needed them to help with harvests, things like that. So it might be that they did go to school, but seasonal. They went when they weren't needed at home. There was obviously a cost impact of going to school, so you did have to have some kind of material to write with. It might be parchment. It might be that you needed a quill. They did use horn books back then, so they weren't all running around with school bags full of textbooks. If they could be fortunate enough to have one, they would have what was called a horn book, that was a piece that was, it had either a prayer or something on it, and then it was covered so it couldn't be like damaged, so you couldn't write on it, you couldn't graffiti it, and it would hang, so they might be hung on the wall, so if you looked at the wall you could be learning your ABC or a prayer, things like that, and they could change it as they got older to something else that they needed to learn. But ultimately, for the common people, education was hit and miss, I would say. There were a variety of schools. There are dame schools which were for boys and girls, but would teach slightly different. So they would try and teach how to read and write if the teacher was able to themselves.
Oh, wow.
Then it would be things like embroidery. So a little girl may learn to start to embroider, and then she could help her mum at home. Things like that. But grammar school was boys only. So girls weren't allowed. So ultimately, if they got to go to dame school and a petty school, which was the one afterwards,
Okay.
they were very, very fortunate. Most girls would be looking at, how do I learn how to embroider? How do I cook? How do I manage my household? How do I help my mum, essentially? Yeah, and they may be sent to other households as well, to not like the nobility, where they're sent for educational purposes, but to start work. And then they'd learn from that household how to manage their own home, but maybe take a few pennies home for their family at the same time. So it was very hit and miss for more common children, unless you were going into the church. So if you were planning on going into the church, the monasteries and the convents, monasteries more so, were very, very involved in education at the time. So they would be guaranteed some kind of education. They would be sent to grammar school. They would be sent to college. So monks at the time were extremely educated. They had degrees. They very well educated. So the monks would then teach young children as well. So the church were big on education, and they did try and use parish priests to just teach parish children when they could, when they weren't busy with the church duties.
Right.
But obviously it was up to each parish on how much time that could be, if there was room for somewhere to do it. Some kind rich person may actually pay for a tutor to come to the village, but ultimately it was very hit and miss on where you lived, what facilities were available, and whether your parents could actually afford to let you go to school.
Wow. Yeah. And I think when we think of the Protestant, or the Reformation, when that happened too, the big reason why that happened, I don't know if that big reason is the right way to say it, but in my head was so that everyone could read the Word of God, right? So these common folk children, I don't know what else to call them, the commoners. These commoners, I assume, were not taught Latin, but were they able to recite it? Do we know? Could they just
Yeah.
recite it and just not know what they were saying?
They were generally the first things they learned would have been their ABC and then prayers. But understanding the words, no. They would have learnt it just by memory. So they wouldn't have understood they would have known that they were praying, obviously, but they wouldn't have been able to translate it, and they wouldn't have understood the meaning behind it other than they were praying. But they could go to church, and obviously at church services on a Sunday, they could listen there and try and learn more if they could. There are people that learn to write themselves. So they'd learn to read first, and then they'd learn to write from their reading, because not all schools would be able to teach writing because the tutor couldn't do it either.
Yeah.
So some people had to teach themselves, but yeah.
Wow.
Sad.
It is. Amy, oh my gosh. Okay. Amy McElroy. This has been such a fascinating conversation today, and I wish we could talk about it for another hour. I really do, because I feel like we just skimmed the surface. But you have a book that's all on the subject of educating the tutors. So why don't you let people know, if they want to learn more, where can they find your book?
So Educating the Tudors is available in most places where you get your books. So it is available in the big stores as well as some of the independent bookstores. It's available directly from the publisher as well, who's Pen and Sword. So yes, all the usual places.
Wonderful. And I'm going to have you back on again soon to talk about another topic of one of your books. So we're just going to keep having you come back until we've covered all of your books.
That's fine by me. I've really enjoyed it. It's been fun.
Amy, thank you.
My pleasure, Rebecca. Thank you for having me.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron-exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tutorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.